So it turns out something really unusual happens when Mars experiences a solar eclipse. And unlike what happens on Earth, this is something scientists didn't really expect. Today we're going to discover what the scientists recently discovered coming from the NASA's InSight probe that's currently on Mars, measuring all sorts of things. And we're also going to discover how the Martian eclipse is a little bit different from the one on Earth. But first, let's discuss what all of this looks like from the surface of Mars and what kind of eclipse we can actually see on Mars to begin with. Many of you are already aware that Mars has two very tiny moons, Phobos and Deimos. Deimos is not particularly exciting because it's really far away. Phobos, however, orbits around Mars every 8 hours, and for several days every single year it passes in front of the Sun, creating these beautiful eclipses that you're going to see as it was seen by the Curiosity rover. So this actually happens for roughly around 30 seconds, it's a very quick event, but during this event the Sun's luminosity drops by about 30%, and this happens every 8 hours for several days. So this is something that we don't actually see on Earth because typically a lunar eclipse is a relatively rare event and it normally covers the entire Sun completely, simply because, completely by accident, the Moon and the Sun are sort of the same size in the skies. But for the first time ever, the InSight mission also got to experience its first eclipse back in April of 2019, and the scientists did a few observations and a few predictions of what they could possibly observe on Mars as well. And just like clockwork, it also repeated on April of 2020, allowing the scientists to get even more data, a lot of which was a little bit surprising. So first of all, what we know about eclipses in general, at least when they happen here on Earth, we know that usually instruments can detect a very sharp drop in temperature and all sorts of wind activity because the atmosphere in the center of the eclipse cools down, which forces the wind from the center to move to the outskirts because of the changes in temperature and pressure. Now we know that on Earth, for example, the temperatures during the eclipse, specifically during the total eclipse, can drop quite significantly. Here's one of many observations produced by NASA, and this shows at least 10 degrees Fahrenheit of drop, which not surprisingly would probably produce very sudden wind gusts. But would something like this happen on Mars as well? Well, this is exactly what the scientists were trying to discover in their data from the InSight mission, as one of these eclipses once again occurred on April 2020. But surprisingly, they did not discover any changes in the atmospheric temperature at all. To confirm that the eclipse was actually observed, they looked at the data coming from the solar panels of the InSight probe, and the amount of energy that was being received by InSight decreased by about 30%. All of this also lasted for roughly around 30 seconds, but no temperature change in the atmosphere. However, something unusual was detected, something coming from a completely different instrument, the one measuring earthquakes. And that's something that the scientists really didn't expect. In other words, it suggested that something was happening to the actual crust of Mars as the Moon was moving in front of the Sun. But here's the kicker, it only happened for 30 seconds. In other words, these were not tidal effects caused by the Moon like they happen here on Earth. We know that our Moon creates tidal effects and the so-called tidal bulge as it orbits around the planet. This is obviously why we have tides on the planet to begin with. Now, something similar could be expected on Mars, but the Martian moons are ridiculously small in comparison. They're technically just tiny asteroids. At the same time, you wouldn't really be able to explain why it only happened for 30 seconds. If this was an event caused by the tidal interaction with the Moon, it should have been at least maybe a few hours long. But what the seismology instrument detected on Mars was only 30 seconds long, for as long as the actual eclipse itself. This was a bit of a mystery for the scientists at first, until they realized something similar has actually been observed here on the planet, but in a very different situation. There is a German observatory known as Black Forest Observatory that has its seismological detector located inside a mine named after me, I guess. Okay, not really me, but it's called Anton mine. Go figure. Anyway, so this observatory had this very interesting incident that happened a few decades ago when, during one of the measurement experiments, someone forgot to turn off the light bulb inside of the mine itself. And it wasn't entirely obvious at first, But for some reason, the seismic detector started to actually detect something happening inside of the granite that the mine was composed of. And it wasn't an earthquake or anything, but it was as if the actual ground itself was shifting in one direction. Just a little bit, not a lot. And although at first it was very shocking, eventually the scientists realized that even the tiny light bulb that was only producing roughly around 60 watt of energy was able to heat up the rock around the mine, which, although not a lot, was enough to start shifting the actual layer of earth above it. And this was detected as a kind of a shift in seismological readings. It wasn't an earthquake, but it was still very unusual. And as you can imagine, something pretty much similar to this occurred during the eclipse on Mars. Essentially, as Phobos blocked the sun as it moved around Mars, this lowered the temperature of the surface of Mars quite dramatically by possibly anywhere from 4 to 5 degrees, and because there is not enough atmosphere to maintain constant temperature, these temperature changes occurred almost instantly within about 30 seconds. And during these 30 seconds of maintaining the low temperature, the actual ground itself shifts enough to be noticeable by the detector. But after these 30 seconds pass, the sun returns to its regular luminosity, and the entire layer underneath shifts back to what it was before. In other words, it seems that there are some really interesting, very major seismological changes that occur on Mars pretty much every time that the temperature changes dramatically. And these changes are even more instant and even more dramatic simply because the atmosphere here is so thin. And because this event can occur anywhere from 1 to even 7 times in a single period every year, this can actually potentially cause earthquakes or Marsquakes by constantly shifting ground due to these temperature changes. And although there is no evidence that earthquakes did occur because of this just yet, we know that it's quite possible. But the most shocking part here is of course that Phobos does have a certain effect on Mars after all, not something that the scientists actually expected at all. Surprisingly, this event also caused unusual magnetic changes, specifically the magnetodetector was able to receive certain signals as well, but currently the scientists believe that this was nothing to do with the moon itself, but most likely was due to the effects that the sun caused on the solar panels, or basically the lack of sun, and so the electrical changes inside the probe may have actually affected the magneto readings. Although future studies will probably reveal the actual details and explain what exactly happened here as well. And as you can probably imagine, these effects are probably even more extreme during the Martian sandstorms or dust storms. A typical dust storm would lower both the luminosity and the temperature in the region by many degrees and could thus lead to potential earthquakes as well. Although as of today, in the last couple of years or so, the probe didn't really discover any major earthquakes. They've discovered about 40 minor earthquakes up to about 4.0 on Richter scale, but nothing significant enough to damage, for example, a colony or something. So in that sense, we think Mars might be safe. It's not safe in terms of radiation, but it seems to be safe in terms of Marsquakes. But anyway, that's so far the major discovery coming from the probe, and it's also something the scientists didn't really expect at all. I'm sure in the next few years, both the InSight probe and some of the future missions such as Perseverance might discover a lot more unusual things about Mars, so make sure to subscribe, share this with someone who loves learning about space and sciences, maybe come back tomorrow to learn something else, and maybe consider supporting this channel on Patreon or by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt you can find in the description below. I'll see you tomorrow, space out, and as always, bye bye.